So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me at a college's applied sciences meeting. I'm going to be talking about some very broad issues, especially the relationships between biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change, and trying to put plant sciences in that perspective. The little diagram you see over there is the response options that have been highlighted in IPBES Nexus Assessment. So maybe a few words about myself. So my faraway distant background is in plant ecophysiology, and I slowly moved on into more looking at ecosystem functioning and biodiversity issues. And for the last 15 years or so, I've been working a lot with the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also as an expert in IPBES, so the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, working on the science policy interface related to biodiversity issues. I'm also locally the coordinator of a research consortium called CEBASC, which is a consortium around biodiversity, agroecology, society, and climate, where we're looking at the nexus issues, trying to look at how you can look at the synergies between biodiversity, climate change, agriculture, and food systems, and try and minimize the trade-offs as we treat those three different crises, the biodiversity crisis, the climate change crisis, and the need to move towards more sustainable food systems. And we're particularly focusing on organism to territorial scales. So I'm going to have two parts of my talk. One is really broad brush. The other one then zooms really tightly in on a very specific issue around agrobiodiversity as one of the solutions that brings solutions that are across the nexus of food, climate, health, water, and so I'm going to start with that, some key messages. So the Nexus Assessment was undertaken. So IPBES is this intergovernmental structure, a lot like the IPCC, where it brings scientists from all over the world together to put together the best scientific evidence to answer questions that are posed by governments related to biodiversity ecosystem services. And they asked IPBES to do an assessment on this interaction between biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change. And I think that's really important in the sense that IPBES really has begun to focus, and even the biodiversity community in a larger sense has really begun to focus on the interactions between these, the strong interactions between these, and how we reach solutions that actually address all of those issues together, and probably even more so than the climate change community, or perhaps even the community working on food systems, or at least part of it. And the statement's pretty simple, and that is that we know that biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change are all intimately related, but we tend to treat them in silos. You just have to look at the way governments are set up. You've got a Ministry of the Environment, you've got a Ministry of Agriculture, you've got a Ministry of Health, and frequently they have a lot of difficulty, as in France, speaking with each other. And when you do those things in silos, as Loica was alluding to, then you wind up with lots of misalignment and unplanned trade-offs and unintended consequences out of policy and management. And so the Nexus Assessment was supposed to look at these and trying to figure out what those unintended consequences, misalignment are, and then how we could do things to try and avoid those and emphasize as much as possible the co-benefits. And so what I'm showing you are, as the first part of my talk, are things that came out of the summary for policymakers of the Nexus Assessment, and that were approved by the plenary of IPBES, which is made up of 150 governments. So these are things that governments read. They said, okay, there was a lot of difficult discussion around this, but these are things that we actually accept as statements. I'm not going to give a broad overview of the entire Nexus Assessment. It's too much to do in a short time period. I'm going to focus on the thing that I'm most expert on, especially over the last 15 to 20 years, are what scenarios tell us about this nexus. And so the first statement is a pretty simple one, and that's moving on from what Loic has said. If you look at trends, things are not necessarily going in the right direction for climate change, biodiversity, and a lot of other environmental variables. If you then project these trends out in the future, if we don't do anything, it just keeps getting worse. And there might even be some tipping points where it gets actually much worse. If we look at scenarios, so we try and make things better, what is really important in this study, it shows that if you do actions that focus on specific elements of it, that is, you treat this problem as if it was in silos, and this probably seems obvious, but not necessarily what is actually happening when you look at policy and management, is that when you look at actions that treat specifically one element of the nexus, it almost always leads to trade-offs in the other elements. And it's especially when you try and treat all of them together, it gets easier and you can avoid many of these trade-offs. Not all of them, but you can. So what I'm going to do is give you sort of the broad brush of what they did. So what they did was they took all of the work that had been done on scenarios related to the nexus and tried to group them by large types of scenarios. And you see 6 different types, and I think and how they're affecting these different nexus elements. So biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate. So if the red arrow is going down, that means it's those scenarios going out in the future are having negative effects. If they're up and blue, then they're having positive effects. And what you see is when you go through these plausible scenarios where you got quantitative outcomes for those different nexus elements, what you see is that conservation first scenarios are, for example, not necessarily good for food. So these are one where you're putting large areas of the world under conservation and you're excluding human activity in those areas. Climate first. So IPCC tends to do a lot of climate first scenarios. And in general, they don't look all that great for biodiversity. And in some cases, because they're spreading biofuels and other things across the entire planet, those are actually having negative impacts also on food production in many of those. And even the food first scenarios tend to result in very large negative impacts on biodiversity, water, and in many cases, climate. And the 2 things that come out as the best are a balanced nexus, and I'll say a couple of words about that, but even nature-oriented nexus approaches can have much more positive effects across the board of these nexus elements. And so what are the kinds of things that go into these positive outcomes for all the nexus elements? So that was the balanced nexus and the nature-oriented nexus in the slide that I previously showed you. They have biodiversity conservation over somewhere between 30 and 40% of the globe, but where they allow human activities in some of those areas. They have large amounts of ecosystem restoration in them, but restoration in a way that is oriented towards preserving and restoring biodiversity. Key component for this discussion is they require sustainable, healthy diets. You can't get there without that. They require sustainable management of natural resources, for example, by the use of water. They require sustainable consumption patterns beyond healthy diets. And they require climate mitigation options that don't overly focus on using land for producing bioenergy. And perhaps from a perspective that's really important that we don't think about too much when we're thinking about these things, is it requires more social justice and social equity. You can't get there to these kinds of approaches. So those are pretty broad brush things. I want to take one specific example of thinking that's coming from the biodiversity community, but you're beginning to see convergent thinking about this kind of thing coming from many different communities. So coming from the biodiversity community, one of the things that we're trying to get across as a message as the negotiations of the global biodiversity framework that was agreed to in December of 2022 is that a siloed approach to biodiversity was not going to work. And so essentially we're trying to say as a scientific community, and the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat was trying to get across to governments is that siloed conservation efforts were not going to solve the biodiversity crisis. And essentially what you see here is a very schematic diagram of what we were talking about. If you take the historical trajectory of the state of biodiversity, it's been going down. If you continue that into the future, it just keeps going down based on everything we can do with business as usual scenarios. And if you want to actually improve the state of biodiversity, you do have to do things like conservation and restoration, but that only counts for a part of solving the biodiversity crisis. You have to have strong climate change action. You have to have sustainable production, in particular in food systems, and reduced consumption, particularly in food systems. And that's a schematic diagram that we drew in 2000, a little bit before 2020. And there actually wasn't a lot of deep scenarios and modeling work behind that. We kind of knew that's where we wanted to be heading. What I want to show you is a very large scenarios and modeling effort that was made by both the climate change community and the biodiversity community to take a look at this, and a presentation that David Leclerc from IASA and myself made at the CBD convention in 2022. I think, well, that's okay, I like the point. The reason that I'm showing this slide is that we're now talking to the biodiversity community about these issues. We really want the biodiversity community to be thinking about nexus issues because they have been overly focused on conservation issues. And I think you can say exactly the same thing about other communities. We really need to have this nexus approach, whether you're looking at climate, whether you're looking at food, whether you're looking at everything else. And that's not happening sufficiently, neither in the scientific community, but especially in terms of policy. And so I want to give you an idea of what's in this. So this is going to dig into the details of why a balanced approach or nature nexus approach can actually be positive. So this is a set of scenarios where we're looking at outcomes for biodiversity, making strong assumptions about climate, and also looking at a wide range of SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and asking the question, what happens if you do strong conservation by itself? And so this is protecting 40% of the planet, not all that strict protection, doing large-scale restoration in a biodiversity-friendly way, asking questions about how important it is that we change diet, especially by reducing by about 50% in developed countries meat consumption, reducing waste by 50%. So we waste about a third of the food that's produced, and also sustainably increasing crop yields, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So this makes strong assumptions about a very large 50% increase over 100 years in crop productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. So what happens if you do each one of these things individually? And then what happens when you do these in what we call an integrated action portfolio, which actually includes all of those actions together. So I'm going to look at this from a biodiversity perspective at first, and then from a broader perspective afterwards. It's a very complicated diagram. It's just to say that this is not just a single model that was being used. It's a number of different scenarios where we're looking at these different sets of conservation, supply side, demand side, or integrated action portfolios with a number, 4 different land use models. And what's really important here is that until very recently at global scales, we only had one model that we could look at global biodiversity trends. Over the last several years, there are now a variety of models where we can look at a variety of indicators of biodiversity at large regional and global scales. And that's very recent. And that lets us do things that are in this slide that has way too much information in it, but I'll walk you through it. So what this is here, and I'll just take, so we're looking at a number of indicators of what would happen under these different scenarios, changes in habitat, natural habitat, changes in the population density of wildlife, whether or not ecosystems are fairly natural, not local, regional extinctions, global extinctions. And in each graph, what you see is the black line is business as usual. So that's just sort of continuing trends, and it just keeps going down. The red line is the supply side. If you just only do the supply side efforts, that's making sustainable agriculture. The blue line is demand side only. So that's mostly changing diet and reducing waste. Green is the conservation. So that's mostly about restoration and protected areas. And the yellow line is the integrated action portfolio. That's when you do these all these things together. And so what do you learn from looking at this? For almost every single one of these indicators, what you see is the integrated action portfolio is much better than conservation only. The conservation only is a bit better than the demand side only, substantially better than the demand side only. Demand side only is a little bit better than supplied only, and that's better than the baseline. And this is the key message that we wanted to get across to the biodiversity community, but it's also applicable to a much broader community. You only get to positive outcomes when you do everything together. And so treating biodiversity in its silo, just focusing on protected areas and just focusing on restoration doesn't get you there. Why is this so important? It's because many NGOs and some scientists were pushing that the global biodiversity framework, which is the international treaty on how we're going to try and address the biodiversity crisis, they wanted to be focusing primarily, if not only, on protected areas and species conservation. And our message is, you can't get there if you do that. You can't get there if you do that. And fortunately, what we wound up is with a global biodiversity framework, which actually treats the nexus. There is a target on sustainable agriculture and agroecology. There is a target on treating climate change. There is a target on treating all of these different nexus issues, which is very different than the climate change treaty, which focuses on climate. And by doing that, we got across the nexus message that's now been integrated into international policy. So to just summarize all that, when we do scenarios, what we see now is that, and the message that we want to get across is that if you do business as usual, that's bad. If you only do conservation efforts, that's better, but it's only by doing integrated action portfolios that you get to a positive outcome. And the key thing about this as well is that when you do that, you also treat many of the other sustainable development goals. You reduce pressure on water use, you feed people better over the entire planet, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These bending the curve scenarios aren't just about making biodiversity better, it's about making all of the nexus better. I think maybe Christian will be and what's really interesting now is there's a real tremendous amount of new work that's being done on these, what I would call sustainable development pathways. So the climate community is now becoming much more interested in integrating the sustainable development goals and biodiversity goals in the way that they're treating climate change issues. And if you're interested in that, there's a number of groups that are working on what we call sustainable development pathways, and I gave some references there. Work that we've been doing in IPBES on the Nature's Future framework is also leading to this idea about treating biodiversity not in its silo, but treating the full set of sustainable development goals. What's important about these scenarios is that they show that hypotheses about how much food we need to produce, how much water we need, how much fertilizer we use, how much pesticides we use, depends enormously on how we address broader issues like diet, food waste, and production, land-based production of energy. So I'm going to take a huge shift in gears. I'm going to stay with the Nexus approach. One of the things the Nexus assessment then did was try it and provide some granularity to that. Overall messages about what would be positive futures. And what they've done is they've listed here in this enormous table is unreadable. It's actually even difficult to read when it's printed on a full page. What they've done is listed more than 70 actions that we know about that can currently have positive effects across the Nexus. And I just wanted to zoom in on that table and show a number of things that we're discussing that are directly related to issues that you might be treating here in plant sciences. So if you look at things like restore soil health, it's good across all the Nexus elements. It's good for biodiversity, it's good for water, it's good for food, it's good for health, it's good for the climate. Agroecology is also good across all the Nexus elements. Reforming public spending, especially focusing on harmful subsidies for agriculture and fishing, is good across all the Nexus elements. So we have the tools that we don't use enough, but we know how things could work that would actually make things better across the Nexus elements. What I want to do in this second part of my talk is focus on one specific component of that, which is about agricultural diversification and what the Nexus assessment says about agricultural diversification. A few simple statements you're probably all aware of, but it's worth reminding ourselves of it, that sufficient and healthy food, including a variety of foods, is important for our health. The lack of agrobiodiversity and diet diversity actually continues to limit health gains, especially in countries with low incomes and in vulnerable situations. Agrobiodiversity has declined over the past and continues to decline, that we depend on just 9 crop species for 65% of the world's crop production. And that's having negative impacts on food system resilience, security, society, economic development, and that the increase in food production hasn't actually been matched by improved nutritional quality. And that's really important to keep in mind. It's not just about producing food, for producing food that's actually good for our health. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about agrobiodiversity for 2 reasons. One is that we're doing a fair amount of work on that locally in our research consortium, and also because my background as a scientist is working on the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services. Most of that work has been in non-agricultural ecosystems, but to some extent in some agricultural systems. And we can look at the different ways that increasing plant diversity could potentially contribute to sustainability in agricultural systems. Through participatory plant breeding or evolutionary plant breeding, varietal mixtures, crop species mixtures or intercropping, extended crop rotations, cover crops, agroforestry, landscape scale crop diversity, and including things like hedges, flower strips, and other things, agricultural infrastructure, agroecological infrastructure at the landscape scale. And when you look at that, and this is where I'm going to try and provide some evidence, when you look at agrobiodiversity, it is one of the ways that we can treat across the Nexus in many ways better than many other approaches in agricultural systems. And that is that agrobiodiversity can demonstrably make large contributions to climate change adaptation, increasing non-cultivated biodiversity, reducing pesticide and fertilizer use, and improving diet quality and human health. So what's the evidence for this? I'm going to use one particular paper as the evidence for this. It was a big meta-analysis this was done, but there's lots of work that shows these kinds of things. So what happens? So this is looking across all types of crop diversification, basically that long list that I just showed there, and looking whether or not it has positive effects on these different nexus elements. So does increasing crop diversity actually increase on-crop diversity? And the answer is, in general, yes. Not always, but in general, yes. Does it improve pest and disease control? The answer is clearly yes. As a matter of fact, that can be much more durable manner to treat disease and pest control than working on specific resistance in individual varieties. Does it help improve water quality? Yes. So you can look across all of these things. It may not help with greenhouse gas emissions, but it does help increase soil carbon stocks. And it doesn't necessarily come at a big cost. So it actually can improve production, and it actually may be not negative for, is that time?
No. Your scale there is a natural log, right?
Okay, yeah, so this is a natural log, yes.
Okay, so
This is positive, but that's good.
Okay, so it's
That's
typically
negative.
it's 10 to 20% effects.
Yeah, something like that. And then what's interesting is then they looked at individual diversification approaches. And what you see is that cultivar mixtures give the least improvement in these different effects. Agroforestry, fairly large effects. Improvements in crop, well, they're organized by intercropping, cover crops, crop rotation. What you can see is there's an increasing effect on these different services that you get out from diversification of agriculture. So just looking at again from a different study, that was a meta-analysis. This is another meta-analysis. So we're just showing for one particular property, which is related to climate change, whether or not you can climate change, but also other effects you can potentially have on biodiversity and water, soil water. Essentially what you're looking at is the amount of carbon in soils here. And if you look at cover crops, crop rotation, or intercropping, the overall effect of this is about a 3% increase in bulk soil carbon. Now that may strike you as a small effect, but a 3% increase in soil carbon is a lot. You can put, if you could do that globally, that's a heck of a lot of carbon that you're storing in soils. This is an old slide, but it's a nice picture, so I use it. Just adding flower strips or prairie strips is good for lots of things, not always, but many times. Well, first of all, it does generally increase non-crop biodiversity. That can have positive effects on control of insect pests and increased pollination. It can also have some negative effects. But it clearly has very large effects on loss of nitrogen, phosphorus in soils from agricultural systems. And just to put it on a national perspective, a very nice study done on intercropping in French farms. So pesticide was reduced on average by 50% in wheat and barley intercrops. Pesticide use for peas was decreased by 83%. Nitrogen fertilizer was reduced by about 50% in wheat, and these did not negatively affect how much farmers earned. And despite that, only about 3% of farms actually use or arable land in France is used for intercropping. And the question is why? And this is not from a science perspective, this is more from a managed perspective. It's relatively straightforward. That is that if you look at ease of implementation, it goes from relatively easy if you're looking at crop monocultures, not too difficult when you're looking at varietal mixtures, to pretty hard when you're looking at intercrops. And that in terms of labor involved, at least for now, you see the same kinds of trends. It's hard to do intercropping and it takes a lot of additional input. What's perhaps not as well recognized is that this doesn't necessarily, it may even have positive impacts on yields. It may not have large impacts on profitability. In some cases, actually can be higher. And what's really important is that it's better for human nutrition and it's way better for pest control. So the question is, why don't we do that? Perhaps primarily from a management perspective, because of this and because of this. And then you can look at the other reasons why we don't do it, and that is that there are really large lock-ins that maintain the system in the state that they currently are. If you look at what you would need to do diversification, do we have the genetic material that's available for diversified crops? Do we have the machinery that's available for it? Well, that's all of what's upstream of the farm. At the farm scale, do we have the knowledge, the social, the support and advice that's necessary for this? Do we have, we study agronomic performance at the farm level? And then downstream of the farm, all of that has to feed into the organization of the market so that you can actually use those diversified products. And so within CBASC, this Biodiversity, Agroecology, Society and Climate Consortium, we're working very closely with a number of non-academic actors, in particular an association called Tenacité, and had developed a living lab at the southern edge of Paris that covers this area here with Paris here. And what we're doing is trying to co-design solutions for agrobiodiversity, among other things, at this regional scale with lots of local actors. And so we meet regularly between these different actors and try and address these different issues. And we bring together lots of different actors, the research community, the NGOs, the local political structures, the agglomeration, so the grouping of communities in this, and the Chamber of Agriculture. And we're trying to address these different things. So for example, from participatory plant breeding, there's a project in place to try and look at how local farmers can actually put in place participatory plant breeding. There's part of a larger project, at least some sites working on varietal mixtures, which is very interesting. So trying to develop decision support tools that allow farmers to more easily use and develop new varietal mixtures. In the near future, more work on crop species mixtures and intercropping, especially in collaboration with the experimental unit of Versailles-Saclay. Looking at how to extend crop rotations with a big effort to try and figure out how to get legume crops more widely used with a strangely enough, one of the huge limiting factors on the Saclay Plateau is actually that birds tend to eat all of the seeds, which is a major issue here. And also a big effort on hedge planting. So the Saclay Plateau may be one of the few areas in France where actually there's a significant increase in the amount of hedges that are being planted compared to the amount of hedges that are being removed. and a very new project around flower strips with farmers to find the best ways to put in place flower strips and look at their positive and negative effects on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so what does this mean for plant sciences? So I'm trying to make the argument that agrobiodiversity treats nexus issues. It's one of our great nexus response options. There's lots of difficulties in putting this in place. I've seen this primarily from a managed perspective, and then ask the question, what does this mean for plant sciences? So it's a tough one. It means if you want to do increased agrobiodiversity, especially through intercropping and varietal mixtures, it means understanding plant-plant interactions, competition, complementarity, facilitation, things that ecologists study all the time. That's what I do a lot of my research on. It needs greater attention paid to forgotten crops, underutilized crops. It requires a paradigm shift away from selecting and testing genetically homogeneous populations, especially in the case of evolutionary plant breeding or participatory plant breeding. Requires greater interdisciplinarity, looking across all of those things that are creating lock-ins in our current system. And of course, greater collaboration, especially in co-design. So with that, I will thank you. There were just a couple of slides on a few specific areas in which ecology can help think about plant sciences.